welcome everyone. I can see that we've got lots of people joined us. So hopefully you all are here for the national webinar from the Community of Practice for Trauma-Informed Care. And this month we are tackling inequality and discrimination. So we've got a number of speakers, and I will crack on. I'm Angela Kennedy. I'm the lead for this trauma-informed care community of practice, clinical lead. So just to start off, I mean, why we've chosen this, obviously there's been during lockdown a big movement around Black Lives Matter and big concern about the number of jobs that we are going to lose as a result of lockdown, which for my region in the north has a kind of disproportionate impact, probably because we also always suffer with that anyway. And this is something that is very close to my heart. I come from a northeastern mining family, and as a result of that, I think inequalities, certain kinds of inequalities have been part of our history. And I think, you know, a lot of us, we bring histories that are often unspoken to the kind of attitudes that we have in our work. And so we thought this might be a really good time to think about some of the inequalities we have in the UK, and most importantly, what that's got to do with trauma-informed practice and what we can do about it. I am particularly concerned around issues of virtue signalling. And what I mean by that is organisations and individuals saying that they are in favour of certain kind of anti-racism or whatever, but they don't really live by those values. And I don't want us to be perceived like that, and I don't want us to be behaving like that. And I certainly feel that being concerned about the issues of adversity and trauma that impact on our mental health really means that we should tackle this in a very real way, not something that's tokenistic. So I'm hoping that together we can find some practical ways of dealing with this. And now we will move on to our first speaker. I'm very pleased that Edward Kanunga, who's an experienced public health consultant, who is going to talk to us about mental health and issues of COVID-19 and how they are impacting on inequalities. So over to you, Edward.
Great, thanks, Angela, and thanks for inviting me to come and speak. So I'm going to talk about mental health inequalities, and obviously COVID-19 has exacerbated and will continue to do so existing inequalities that we have known for a long time. And contrary to some high-profile people who, in the first few weeks of the pandemic landing on our shows, described COVID-19 as the great leveler, and people suggesting that we are in it together, nothing could be further from the truth. We are not in it together as far as COVID-19 is to be considered, and for a long time, sadly, we will continue to see the impact and the disproportionate impact on communities. And I'll just make reference to something which I saw on the social media, which was meant to be a joke, really, but actually, to an extent, signifies or demonstrates the challenge we have with COVID-19. So this was someone saying, isn't it strange how COVID-19 started in China, was brought to this country certainly through imported cases from Europe, but sadly the people for whom this will have the greatest impact might never have set their foot outside of this country with regards to the inequalities agenda. And sadly, we are beginning to see the clustering of some of these local outbreaks, and we will continue to see the impact disproportionately being greater on those communities who were already disadvantaged and deprived. So in terms of health inequalities, there obviously is a big debate on how best do you describe health inequalities. And I'm not going to go into an academic debate, perhaps that's for another day, on what the right definition of health inequalities should be. But I'll pick up on my favorite definition, which talks about health inequalities being unwarranted differences or variations in health status, in social circumstances, in vulnerabilities, in risks, in access to services, and as a result, differences in outcomes and the impact we have on people's lives. It talks about health inequalities being socially produced, so they are not down to individual choices. Health inequalities are systemic and systematic, so they are not just happening by chance. They are as a result of choices that are being made from a policy level. They are not inevitable, they are avoidable, which means that they can be reversed and things can be done. And fundamentally, they are about injustice. So they are unfair and they are unjust. So it means that they do come with consequences. And sadly, those consequences sit with our most disadvantaged and our most vulnerable communities. Dahlgren and Whitehead has got a famous model, which I'm sure people will be familiar with, which kind of people refer to as the rainbow model, which talks about the social determinants of health, which does accept that constitutional factors like age, gender, race, ethnicity do have a role to play, but actually they are not the only explanation of health outcomes for individuals and for communities. And that whilst individual lifestyle factors might play a role, the biggest impact on health, and in this case, mental health, is to do with the conditions in which people are born, the conditions in which they grow and develop, work, and age, having a bigger impact on their health outcomes and their health status than a focus on individual and constitutional factors. And I think this is very important because what we saw in the early days of the pandemic was perhaps some overzealous scientists trying to explain away the disproportionate spread in the infection to try to link it with genetics and with constitutional factors. And again, that is bad science. And we do know that even the spread of infections is not uniformly distributed in a population, and the conditions in which people are born, where they grow, develop, and age have got a bigger impact. And we're beginning to see that playing out as the pandemic progresses. Public Health England have got a very useful infographic that talks about the social gradient and which shows, depicts like a football match where people are playing on a hill to an extent, with your deprived and disadvantaged communities playing uphill, and how right from the beginning of that match, they are at a very clear and obvious disadvantage. And even despite their best efforts, trying to play uphill is always going to lead to them losing that. So I think that there has been a number of images that have been used to portray the latest one being that video of young people going on a race and you being asked about your social status. And depending on your answer, you either take a step forward and a step back. And isn't it any surprise that when we look at the finishing line, that there are some communities who always have a disproportionate poor outcome compared to others? Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise because of the unlevel playing field that people find themselves in. So what does this have to do with mental health? So, well, we know that the pandemic has had an impact on the entire population, really. So no one has really been spared from the mental and emotional impact of the pandemic. And I think we'll be kidding ourselves if we say that it has not affected ourselves, even those of us on this webinar. However, what we do know is that for those people who were already disadvantaged, the impact is significantly worse, and actually their ability to recover from that is very, very much limited. And again, it's an uphill task. We know that the trauma of such events is not uniformly distributed, and we know that people from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, people who are deprived, people from socially excluded groups, and people with some protected characteristics will have worse outcomes compared to others. So already we know that existed before, and COVID-19, perhaps like a big spotlight, has come and brought to light the things that we know have existed for a long time. One of my colleagues, who's a professor of public health up in Newcastle, published something on health inequalities and COVID-19, and she described COVID-19 as a syndemic pandemic. In other words, saying that the pandemic has come to us at a point in time where we already had pre-existing issues regarding early years outcomes, the childhood adversity, the adverse childhood experiences, the impact that we already know exists around economic security. And what we are beginning to see is how the COVID-19 lockdown response, but also the economic recovery, is having a significant negative impact on issues that were existing even before COVID-19. So we are already seeing companies laying people off, mass redundancies that we have already witnessed and will continue to see. We already saw the impact, disproportionate impact on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups, both from a frontline worker point of view, but also in terms of the outcomes for the community at large. And that is a reflection of some of the occupational exposures and the limited power and control that exists in some of these communities. So that was there before. And I think what COVID-19 has brought about is because it's a disease that from the time you are exposed to the time of death, I think I was reading a Lancet article which was saying for those people who die from this disease, you have got a maximum of 56 days. So from the time of having exposure to death, on average, is about 56 days. So unlike cancer, unlike diabetes, unlike other things that you've got a bigger lag time, COVID-19 has condensed that time scale and really has left no place to hide in terms of the inequalities that we are witnessing. So the trauma impact is not going to be uniformly distributed across the population. It will follow the patterns that have existed before in terms of socioeconomic disadvantage, in terms of social exclusion, in terms of some of the excluded communities that were already existing. We know that getting the disease and the severity of the disease, there are differentials in exposure. We know there are differentials in vulnerability, and we know that there are differentials in terms of outcomes. We cannot run away from that. And aligned to that will be disproportionate impact in terms of mental health for the different communities affected by this. We also know that we're going through different phases. So lockdown is gradually being eased, but we know that the impact will remain with some of those deprived and disadvantaged communities. And we know that the mental health impact on these communities is going to be massive and significant, and it will last for a significant period of time, especially when you add to that the post-COVID-19 recovery and what it will do to the social fabric, to the economic fabric, and the resources that you will need for these communities to recover. So we know that the mental health impact will go across the life course. There is a model from Hertfordshire Public Health Team, which is very helpful in terms of looking at the mental health impact at the different stages of life. We also know from colleagues in Wales, the Welsh Public Health system over there did a health impact assessment, and of all the impacts, they have highlighted that mental health is definitely going to be negatively impacted. It will definitely have a long-term impact, and the consequences from this will be far-reaching. So I think we cannot run away from the fact that health inequalities that existed from a mental health point of view, ranging from suicide rates, physical health of people with serious mental illness, all the way through to perinatal mental health, which already had a socioeconomic gradient, which already had disadvantaged and vulnerable communities disproportionately being affected, will be further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it doesn't mean that, and I finish off with kind of my opening remarks really regarding health inequalities. These things are not inevitable. These things are avoidable. They are unjust, they are unfair, but actually they can be changed. So we can't just sit back and say, well, it is going to be what it will be. And I'm really encouraged by webinars such as this, where we can have the discussion, and looking forward to colleagues who are going to present later on to hear more about some of those injustices, some of the discrimination that COVID-19 has exposed, and perhaps think about how we can respond collectively as a system so that we do not leave individuals behind and we do not leave communities behind. So I'll stop there for now. And thanks again for the opportunity, Angela.
Thanks so much for that, Edward. I completely agree with you in terms of, it doesn't feel to me like everyone is in this together, and it really is highlighting some things. But in that sense, this is also an opportunity for us to really start to tackle some things in a much more real way than we have in the past. So I'm really pleased now to welcome Shilpa Ross. Shilpa, I hope you've been able to join us now. Shilpa is a researcher from the King's Fund, and they've also been doing some great work around this area. So Shilpa, over to you.
Hi there. Hello, everyone. So thanks to members of this group for your invitation. My name's Shilpa Ross. I'm a senior researcher in the policy team at the King's Fund. I led the piece of research we've just recently published about workforce race inequalities and inclusion in the NHS, which I'll be giving a very brief overview of today. And due to shortness of time, I'm going to skip a lot of the context and background information. Please do, if you're interested, please do check out our website for the full report and the related materials, such as the, we've got a sort of an illustrated feature and a short animation which brings to life aspects of our research. So to explain the research, essentially we had two main questions in mind. One was, we wanted to understand in more detail what's it like to work in the NHS as a person from an ethnic minority background. What is the lived experience, if you like? We have quite we have big data on this from the Workforce Race Equality Standard, or the RES, but we wanted to understand the issue in a more qualitative way. And the second area of focus is we wanted to understand how NHS organisations were addressing race inequalities. Could I have the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So in 2019, we put out an open call for ethnic minority staff to take part in the research. They could flag their interest in participation by filling in a short survey that would give us just some basic information about them, and we would use that to sort of pull out our sample of interview participants. So we asked about their ethnic background, their role in the NHS, and if they could just say in a few words what they would like to talk about in an interview. The majority of people that responded to that mini survey were from Black or Asian backgrounds, and respondents were actually employed in a very wide range of roles in the NHS. So some in clinical roles, some in not clinical roles, some and a very small number from the arm's length bodies as well. We selected a smaller number of respondents to take part in an interview, a one-to-one interview. That sample, we tried to ensure that there was a mix in terms of job role, ethnic group, and the kind of theme of the lived experience that they'd indicated in the mini survey. So in the interviews, I'd say the main themes that we heard about are a perception of unequal opportunities for career progression and the impact of microaggressions. The interviews gave us a really strong sense of people's sadness, their frustration, their anger about the things that shape their experiences of being at work. And if I may, I just want to read out a couple of quotes, and you will find these and many more in the resources that I mentioned at the top of my presentation. You can find them on our website. So I'm going to quote from a couple of different people. One is, we have staff that call it the plantation coming to work. So there's some very deep-rooted stuff happening in the organisation. I think as the black staff are generally employed in lower bands and the managers are all white, so it becomes like a slave master type situation. And another quote, in a non-clinical setting, many of my thoughts in meetings have been dismissed, especially by older white men and women. It seems a young BAME female doesn't have something worth listening to in this environment. It's really knocked my confidence. Could I have the next slide, please? So going back to our second question about how NHS organisations are addressing race inequalities, we focused on 3 NHS providers where there are some promising signs, either through performance against the RES, the Workforce Race Equality Standard, or other factors such as the diversity of the leadership team. So we selected Calderdale and Huddersfield, Bradford District and East London. At the time of the research, 2 of those trusts had a chief executive from an ethnic minority background, and one of those was a woman as well. And since then, Bradford has appointed a black woman as chief executive. Our approach to the research was to interview a similar set of individuals in each organisation and try to understand from their reflections what had changed and how it had changed and how it felt to be a part of that. The common interventions that we saw across all 3 organisations were staff networks and using the freedom to speak up guardian role as a way to enable conversations about race. And in both Bradford and Calderdale and Huddersfield, they were using leadership development programmes to try to support ethnic minority staff with their career development and progression. So, of course, in the report, we discuss how leadership and allyship both play a really important roles in addressing race inequalities in different ways. So, for example, the impact that diverse boards and management teams can have on the wider workforce, the need for distributed leadership. So we're not saying that this work is only for boards to take on. And actually damage can be done if people are left out of strategic diversity and inclusion discussions. So it is very much a case of pulling in as many people as many people as possible into this important work. Also, we talk in the report about leaders holding the tensions when it comes to race inequality. So this could be quite practical in terms of ensuring and giving cover for time for staff to participate in the efforts of the trust in terms of working towards race equality and inclusion. It could also be things such as constructively engaging with and addressing any resistance which might crop up when it comes to putting into place interventions such as the ones I've mentioned. It can happen. These interventions can either create or exacerbate existing divisions, and it's really important for leaders to keep a watch for that kind of thing. There are also more practical, though not necessarily easy, things to be done to remove obstacles. So we would point to recruitment processes or addressing things like lack of awareness about cultural and racial differences and race equality issues more generally. Though those are very important to get hold of. So did we find the magic solutions when it comes to addressing race inequality? Of course, we didn't find a one-size-fits-all type of approach at all. These are very complex issues. But I, for one, I wouldn't dismiss what is possible, and with sustained commitment over time, it was possible. If I could have the final slide, please. Oh, okay. But just to say that it's what we thought was important was to consider data in the round when it comes to understanding what type of progress has been made. And there are important clues in the lived experience or qualitative data that might not show up in something like the RES. As I said, I need to be brief, so I will leave it there. I'm not sure if I will be able to stay for the Q&A, but I understand that the organisers of this event are happy to collate any questions that you might have and forward them to me. You can find me via the King's Fund website if you want to know any more. Thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Thank you, Shilpa, and it's really interesting. Yes, you know, in the NHS, we also have to get our own house in order, and that might be an easier place to start in some ways because at least we have some influence over that. So next speaker is Samantha Reynolds, who's a clinical psychologist in training, and she's going to be talking to us about anti-racism as a key for trauma-informed practice. Over to you, Samantha.
Hi everyone, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I think that was quite a nice segue actually into what I'm going to be speaking on about getting your house in order as a starting place. So yeah, we'll see if that comes through. I'm going to be quite concise and hopefully keep to my time. So just to add to the context that everyone's given already, we are living in a time when people racialized as Black are up to 4 times more likely to die from coronavirus, 5 times more likely to die during childbirth, 4 times more likely to be detained against their will under the Mental Health Act, up to 8 times more likely to be placed in a community treatment order, 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police, 5 times more likely to have force used on them by the police, and on average earn between 10 to 20 pence for every pound of wealth that a white British person has. So to simply state that there are health and social inequalities that exist feels like an understatement, but it's becoming clear to more and more people that we have an ongoing problem in the UK. And so why am I reminding you of this here? Well, racism and statutory services are inextricably linked, and the outcomes like the ones that I've just stated can have psychological and biological consequences for people from minoritized groups. And I do speak mostly on the Black experience because of my own areas of research being focused on the inequalities that Black people face. And of course, because of my own vested interest in this type of equality, because I am Black, if you hadn't noticed. And but similar trends to varying extents do also apply to people from Asian and other minoritized communities. So the reason why this is so important to hold in mind when considering trauma-informed care is that experiences of these inequalities do result in psychological and biological consequences akin to typical trauma symptoms. And Gomez Diaz and colleagues in the States are just some of many people who have used the term racial trauma to capture the impact of ongoing, consistent, enduring stress that is caused by experiences of prejudice and discrimination, either against yourself or witnessing that in people who look like you. And these incidents do not have to be explicit, and I would argue that within healthcare systems, they often aren't, but small unintentional acts of racism are still very violent and have an impact. In her Winston Churchill Fellowship Report, Dr. Karen Treisman acknowledges the role of cultural humility and responsiveness as being a key value and principle to trauma-informed care. And she really thoughtfully outlines that adopting this value involves, in her words, acknowledging, respecting, reflecting on, honouring, and being curious about collective, institutional, and historical trauma, violence, and oppression. And she also recognises that to do this requires an extensive awareness and understanding of what she refers to as complex and multi-layered areas such as slavery, colonisation, genocide, immigration, poverty, etc. I haven't got a link to that report on the slide because I missed it off, but I will post it in the chat once I finish talking and send it over to the organisers too. So how does this idea of cultural humility, responsiveness and addressing racism translate to our work? It translates in multiple ways because this issue is so nuanced, but it includes things like recognising how power dynamics are exacerbated by racism and privilege, and how racism may influence interactions with services and with healthcare professionals, and how racism influences the decisions that professionals make, both about individual treatment, but also at a broader level in thinking about service provision. In Karen Treisman's report, she invites us to consider questions about how our policies, funding and procedures can be helpful or harmful. And in the article linked on the slide, the fourth reference down, Nimisha Patel and Harshad Keval share some really useful tasks for individuals, teams and institutions to engage in when thinking about adopting an anti-racist approach. Now, as a slight aside, I was in a meeting yesterday talking about how to address racial inequalities, and someone mentioned that perhaps we need to come up with solutions that white professionals and people in positions of power will find worthwhile engaging in. And I was really taken aback by this, because I was thinking, how can we live in a world where doing the work necessary to adopt an anti-racist outlook could possibly be deemed as not being worthwhile to use, not a worthwhile use of resources and energy. But I am aware that there is some naivety in that perspective, because this isn't a priority for everyone. And for that reason, we need to draw an extra focus on ensuring that the care that we provide does have equal implications for all of the people that we provide it to. And we need to actively keep racism on the agenda to do that. I've spoken holding in mind the position of people who use our services, but this also definitely does apply to colleagues and the people that we work with. And the last link on the slide that will be sent around thinks about Black and BAME colleagues. Race in itself is a socially defined category system that was used to justify abusive treatment of people who are not white. And therefore the solution lies in the social responsibility to ensure that oppression based on this thing that was created and that we continue to use called race is not maintained and perpetuated in our policies and in the care that we provide. And I would argue that people who work in healthcare would, at least for the most part, say that they are not racist and do not actively make decisions about health and social care on the basis of how people are racialized. But what that tells us then is that to be not racist is not enough, and we need to be proactively anti-racist in ourselves and in our systems, particularly if we are aiming to adopt a truly trauma-informed position in the care that we provide. So the links on the slide provide various places to start with this work, and I think are useful tools for reflection within oneself and with colleagues, with teams. There's so much out there, and I wasn't sure how to share it all with you, but here's somewhere to start, and I'll be really interested to hear people's reflections and questions about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. That was really excellent. And I think one of the things that it brings to my mind is how hard it is to give up power, and that's regardless of what that power pertains to. And I think the comment that was made, maybe you need to make it worth their while. Well, if you have to give up power, they might never feel like it's quite worth their while. So how do we create a fairer society that's based on a more common humanity and compassion? And I think that's maybe the mentality that might help us with some of that. So thank you, it's really interesting. And yes, hopefully we'll be able to continue this conversation on the Futures platform. So Samantha, you might like to pick up some of these points here, and I'm really pleased you've added some resources there. That's very helpful, thank you. So our next speaker is Kevin Vento, who is going to talk about trauma in the lives of young Black British men and its relation to mental health. So over to you, Kevin.
Hi, yeah, so my name's Dr. Kevin Vento. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist working in South London, the Maudsley Trust. And I'm really passionate about this. I mean, it's been great listening to the speakers already, because it's all kind of, it feels like it very much flows what I'm going to talk about now. So my topic is looking at young Black British men's mental health and understanding the role of trauma. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you is that I've been a qualified clinical psychologist for over 10 years now. I worked in IAPT, and I remember when I started in IAPT, I realised that it wasn't very representative. I noticed that my service was in an inner city area in London, but the people who came wanting help with their depression and anxiety were not the young Black people who lived in that area. And then I went and moved into, worked in the secondary care service in a CMHT, and I saw more Black people there. And more recently, I've been working for the last 6 years, I've been working in an early intervention service, working specifically with psychosis. And pretty much the majority of the people I worked with were young Black men. And their experiences of services has been shocking. And it pulls on your emotions when you hear about some of their journeys. I've been very fortunate to have one of my current young people here with me today. His name's Kenneth. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to give you all a kind of an experiential understanding of what it might be like and what the challenges are with regard to engaging certain members of the community. So the first bit I wanted to talk about was how engagement is a real problem. And I suppose it's my thoughts about what I saw in IAPT and the fact that there weren't many young Black people coming into that service, but then later on in a secondary care setting, there seemed to be more people who've had compulsory admissions, medication that they've and being restrained, and these are all the things that Samantha's already talked about. And I was just, and this is where I'd like to invite Kenneth to talk about what he thought about this.
Hi everyone. It's quite interesting to see what everyone has to say, but in my experience, sometimes I think culture has a big part to actually play, and when you're getting admitted, sometimes when you're in A&E and you're trying to talk to the doctors what you've actually been through traumatically, they actually overlook most of the time what you're actually saying to them, and then they pass it off as maybe psychosis or maybe what you're going through is not real. I come from the South London area where criminal activity is very, 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 very vast and very, very, very evident. And sometimes they can't fathom the type of things that happen that police don't see on a regular basis, that goes behind the police radar. And sometimes when you're trying to explain traumatic experiences that you've been through, they think that you're just being delusional, and then they end up sectioning you for stuff that you've actually seen live, and then it makes you not trust the services. And what I wanted to also make notice of is involving families in like minorities and Black people, like to involve the parent, because there's a big stigmatism with Black people in going into mental services or having a therapist to talk about their situations. They never think that they can talk it through. They think that, oh no, people are going to think about me like this, or people are going to think about me like that. but in the reality, talking about your situation actually takes a big weight off you, and it relieves the stress, which doesn't later then take you down the road of like constant readmissions.
So it sounds like you're talking about developing trust and engaging, staff, NHS staff, engaging the communities that they serve. And I think that's really important. And part of that engagement is actually understanding where people are coming from, understanding the challenges. On my slides, I talked about kind of being aware of those social inequalities and microaggressions. And we've already talked quite a bit about that today. And it's really, and I suppose one of the things that motivated me to talk today is because I am a black male therapist. I am from South London. I've grown up in an inner city area, and I suppose when I do work with people, that kind of experience that I've had also informs how I approach the people that I work with, and I think it's really important that NHS staff are trained, are equipped, and really understand the challenges that some of the people that we're working with go through. So building trust is really important, and I think that one of the things that really struck me about the work that I've been doing with Kenneth is that I remember you were telling me, Kenneth, that you've tried psychology before, you've tried to work with other people, and engagement and trust has always been a challenge. Yeah. And then, do you want to tell everyone about your experience?
Sometimes when you're trying to explain to non-black professionals in this area, sometimes they do not see the cultural side and where you're actually coming from. Like, I have to touch again on the South London area. Even though there's a lot of good areas inside South London, I won't say South London's totally bad, but like a lot of the kids are running wild, and because they haven't got proper guidance and people are not directing them in the right way, they tend to go off the rails, and that comes into mental health as well in a very, 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 very big way. Sometimes some of the young kids that are coming in that I've seen inside hospital as well, like sometimes the stories that they tell me and how they got there is very, very, very shocking. And to be honest with you, like, I think there needs to be a way that the trust can actually facilitate in understanding cultural differences inside the mental health with minorities inside the situation, because I've seen it firsthand. Like, when you're in A&E, when you're talking about white counterparts, sometimes they've got the support there so they don't get hospitalized. But sometimes when you don't have the support there, instead of them trying to understand what you're trying to say, they hospitalize you quickly. And this goes into like therapy, not only mental therapy, but how to cure or to facilitate other ways of actually making people's mental health well as well. So
I think the key message here is that more effort needs to be made with engaging the community and really understanding those traumas. I think I'd leave it there because I know time's short, but I really think that it's really up to the NHS and the leadership to really guide us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And Kenneth, your points really resonated. I think it was really powerful. So thank you for coming along and joining us today. What you were saying about, being heard, I remember very early on reading a paper that simply said, what I needed to do as a therapist was bear witness, which is just listen and hear so that people feel truly heard. And I thought, well, that sounds a bit easy, but actually really hearing at a deep level what somebody's experience is probably one of the most challenging things when things are really hard to listen to. And I think organisationally, that's probably one of the reasons why organisationally we don't really place enough value on that. So thank you as a reminder, and because I think it's a really important point. And also the issue of having staff that are drawn from the communities in which they serve. That's one of the recommendations in a report I've read recently on tackling inequality, and I think it might have been the Centre for Mental Health, but I'm not entirely certain because I've read a few, so they're all blending in. And again, I think that's also very important. It needs to be similar, and often we assume that it has to be health service as well, and maybe it doesn't always need to be. Maybe we need more community orientated services, peer services that can really help people feel understood, and then link with services to be kind of advocate on their behalf. So really important points you made there, Kenneth, thank you. So finally, I'd like to introduce to you Mike Cherrington, who is going to talk about housing development and talk about how that's trauma informed and a bit about their journey in tackling inequalities.
Hello. Mike. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome.
I've got the mute back. Yeah, Red Supported Living is it provides shared accommodation for people in 2- and 3-bedroom homes in Ferry Hill, which is in County Durham of the northeast of England. And what I'd like to do is, just for the 5 minutes, is just to go through a journey which I think is quite traumatic for the individuals that we have. So we have adults from 18 all the way through to about 66, 67 years old, and we provide about 47 placements in the community of Ferry Hill and Chiltern. When someone comes in to us into the initial process, they can be referred in through housing, or it can be a self-referral from a friend or a family member, and they're homeless really at that point. So in terms of homeless, they could be sleeping rough on the streets, they could be sleeping with friends, etc. But they're quite distressed at the time. But it's interesting on this, as you go through the journey with people, they do feel very much traumatized, and a lot of the people we have suffered significant trauma, mental health issues, and they come with that. But some of them have almost been not sort of accessing into services and have been left out by themselves. So some of the major things that we find that in the income on universal credit and the high levels of sanctions which discriminate against people because they have no money. The food poverty is huge as well, because we deliver food through Food Share on a Tuesday. We have other donations through Asda, Tesco's and various other places, and that's a constant thing when people have no food. So the first thing is to provide them with some shelter, to give them a base, if you like, going back into the basic levels of anything for a human being. And then it's the food. And I like some of the things said by the last speaker in terms of the trust and the relationship and getting down to the basic level, because I think we have a big job of building up trust with people at, if you like, the cold face, because we are right where a person comes, they've got no worldly belongings, they've just got a carrier bag, if they've got that, or the clothes they're standing in, they've got zero, they've got bad mental health. Lots of them have drug and alcohol problems. They've got horrific family breakdowns, with a lot of people not being able, if their fathers or mothers, not being able to see the children, which has a major impact on them as well. Now, accessing services is an interesting one, because a lot of our people, they don't access services, so we help them get registered with universal services, but also access mental health services and other services that they may need. Before they come to us, they wouldn't have that opportunity to do that. Some of the, I think the big thing for me is, and I think it's quite sad in such a rich country that we live in, such a rich economy, is a lot of our people feel hopeless and they have a lot of lack of hope in their lives, and they feel as if they can't get any further forward. So it's not uncommon most days for people to talk to me and other staff members to say that they feel quite suicidal. And I felt it very sad yesterday. We have an older guy who's suicidal, and the crisis team came out and he's just gone into hospital, and he felt he wasn't able to access services until he got a little bit of support from the support workers to make those calls and support him to do that. So I think for me, some of the big things that I've pulled out of being involved now about 3 years Red Supported Living is that people seem to be left behind. So a lot of our people are left behind, and I sort of question, you know, services and statutory services and whatnot and government policies. There's a lot of people that we see daily just left behind, and no one seen from their point of view. They say to me that no one cares about me, and that till they came in here, that this is the only place or contact they've had that someone says, well, we'll help you. So to me, that's quite a traumatic sort of journey. The other interesting thing I was going to say, Angela, is that our leader, if you like, Yvonne, is a Black Afro-Caribbean woman, and she suffered a lot of discrimination being here in predominantly a white population and a white-dominated council and people in power. But we continue to work through that. We don't have a lot of ethnic minorities. We have 2 guys who are Afro-Caribbean, and we have an Asian guy because of the makeup in the population around here. But Yvonne, as you know, and the fellow manager, has suffered a lot of discrimination, and I think that's another thing as well. And I think there should be a bit more togetherness from, you know, statutory services and NHS to support smaller projects like ours, because it provides such a valuable service to people that are in need, and we can provide that on a daily basis. So I think that's, you know, quite an important point. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yes, and I was impressed that Yvonne had kind of not given up really, and instead had set up this, it's a community interest company, isn't it? Had set this up out of her own adversity for other people suffering a different kind of discrimination and inequality. But I think in terms of an example of, you know, how you provide hope and the basics of what you need for life, it was a good example. So thank you, Mike. And I think you're right, you know, leaving people behind in a society is not good for anybody. It's not just not good for them. It says a lot about our society if we leave people, young people particularly, on the streets with no home. And that's such an increasing problem that we seemed to be able to tackle a bit better during COVID. And yet beforehand we were claiming we couldn't do anything about it. Well, I don't believe that. So thank you, Mike. That's all for me. Thank you very much for joining us. It is just a kind of dipping our toe in the water today, and we're hoping that hopefully some good things might come out of it. So let's network more about this, and thank you very much, and goodbye.